Alright, so Zapatista National Liberation Army, a guerrilla group in southern Mexico. So they talk a lot about being not a new group, but about being just a continuation of 500 years of indigenous resistance to colonialism and other forms of exploitation that indigenous people have had to undergo. So a couple of the things that they specifically talk about are the lack of representation of indigenous people in any sort of government, in any positions of power. You will mostly see people of European heritage or mestizos, especially in Mexico, and the marginalization of the Indian identity, meaning that they talk a lot about we're just a mestizo country, we're all mixed race, and that's what makes us strong. And then that obviously marginalizes people who are proud to be indigenous and to not have that mixed heritage as well. Mostly indigenous people are still living in the rural areas, and development is centered in the cities. So that leaves a lot of issues with lack of schools or healthcare or roads or lighting or other necessities for indigenous people. And just this past summer, there was a court case that was going on over a military general who had raped and brutalized a bunch of indigenous women, and they were finally going to court. It was over 15 years he'd done this, and that's not a one-time kind of thing. Indigenous women are said to be triple marginalized because they're poor, because they're women, and because they're indigenous. And so that has been also an important part that I'll talk about the Zapatistas. So the ejido is a communal land, which was what was originally in Mexico, that people wouldn't own land but would communally work it and have it in common. And in the Mexican Constitution after the Revolution, that was also a right that was set forth for the people. But after the U.S. Intervened throughout the 20th century, that got taken away, and they had large landowners who would have indigenous people working their land in a feudal sort of system, and the indigenous people had no rights over the land that they were working on. So the name Zapatista comes from Emiliano Zapata, who was a Mexican revolutionary. He was one of the four main revolutionaries that kept the revolution going in the early 1900s. So what had happened was that there was a dictator for 35 years, and then they ousted him, and another president came in, but he was not actually for the people. He worked with a lot of the revolutionaries, but then once he got into power, he struck down basically everything that he promised that he was going to do. And so Zapata, along with Pancho Villa and a couple of other people who were from the north, he's from the south of Mexico, which is more indigenous and more rural. They kept the fight going with the blend of Ayala, which called for reform, freedom, justice, and law, which were the things that the president had called for and then didn't follow through on. He was mostly a farmer, and so his main issue was getting land to the peasants because that was their way of living. And instead of having a military, he just had indigenous people who would join him in the different places that he would go. And that's the same sort of model that the Zapatistas now use of mobilizing indigenous people where they are. And instead of going a more political route, he demanded land for the people and would just occupy it and take it for the indigenous people, so that then they wouldn't have to wait for the political process. Fast forward to 1994. On January 1st of 1994, NAFTA, a free trade agreement, was ratified, and to coincide with that, the Zapatistas launched their first offensive kind of action. They went from Chiapas, Mexico, which is in the southernmost state, all the way to Mexico City. 5,000 people went to Mexico City and had 4,000 or so stay in Chiapas and like occupy the land that they had already taken. And their main goal with this was to empower and organize the indigenous people who had basically had no support given to them, and stop the trajectory of racism, neglect, genocide, and exploitation that began with the conquest and is still currently happening, which is why the Zapatistas are still around today. And as the first Zapatistas went to Mexico City, they were very determined to not harm any civilians and to make sure that everything that they were doing violently was for a purpose. The army, however, did the opposite of that and went door to door, murdering people who they thought were even part of this or would maybe become part of the Zapatistas, and basically scare people into not supporting them. And because of how violent the state reacted, there was a lot of international outcry for the Zapatistas, and they started the global justice movement, basically just supporting different indigenous and other uprisings that were for peace and justice. One super cool thing about the Zapatistas is the way that they organize themselves. So it's like an entire state of Mexico that they are in. And so all of their demands are like supposed to be nationalized. So they don't have enough people right now to have them over the whole nation. But they're not only concerned with their own state, which I think is really cool. They invite people from any sort of ideological background, and they're really big on democracy and making sure that everybody is heard. They do not representative democracy, but direct democracy, and talk amongst themselves. Most of their villages are between 12 and 150 families. So for most issues, it's possible to just talk about things. For larger things, they have the Council of Good Governance, which is what this is, where people for 2 weeks rotate to do bigger issues. They are extremely feminist and make sure that women have the right to be in any sort of positions of power that men are also in. If it's not necessary to have a specific leader or to have any sort of hierarchy, then they don't put that in, and they make sure that it is indigenous-led because these areas are so heavily indigenous, and because of the issues that they're encountering are mostly indigenous issues. Zapatismo. This is their kind of ideology is called Zapatismo. And they said that it was a mix of Western Marxism and the experience and knowledge of Native American population that has been resisting colonial Spanish state and the federal Mexican state for 5 centuries. So that means that obviously Marxist thought was not native to these indigenous people, but they still have been resisting without that ideological backing for hundreds of years. So coming out of the jungle was this group of people, intellectuals from the city who were let's go radicalize all of these indigenous people. And so they had this really firm Marxist backing. And then they met up with these indigenous people and were just blown away by how much cool stuff the indigenous people were doing without that. And also were sort of backed up from being just strongly and outwardly Marxist because that wasn't the context that the indigenous people were living in. And so they found more of a mix of what made sense for what the people were actually living. From everything that I've read, they don't like to have any sort of name for what their ideology is besides Zapatismo. I've heard them called anarcho-socialist, but they're definitely anti-neoliberal and do a lot of stuff against neoliberalism. I mean, the fact that they started being public on the day that NAFTA was ratified is pretty clear for that. They're not anti-globalization. They do a lot with internet and other sorts of forms of communication to get their message out. They are probably the indigenous group that utilizes those sorts of resources the most. But they are for altered globalization, meaning that cultural sharing happens and support across the globe happens, but that it's not any sort of economic imperialism or any sort of thing like that. And they make sure that it doesn't, that the base of it is not people coming in who have not lived the experience of the indigenous people, but it is the indigenous people themselves who are the basis of the radical way of living. So when they started being public in 1994, they came up with a bunch of demands, which I will split into 3 different groups. So the first are political demands, and they said that without democracy, there can be no liberty, justice, or dignity, and without dignity, there is nothing. So pretty intense. Their main one is democracy. Like, they are really into people being able to represent themselves, because they talk a lot in Mexico about being a democracy and, like, you can vote, even though there's, like, tons of voter fraud, and everybody knows that the institutionalized parties are going to be the ones that win. So the Zapatistas have fought for real democracy, for any sort of undemocratically appointed officials to be to step down, for the Zapatista National Liberation Army to be recognized as a belligerent force and not as a peaceful one, because they want to be taken seriously and are not afraid to use force when necessary, and will not stop or go into any sort of peace accords that would make them stop their actions unless things will be radically changed, which would probably mean the dissolution of the Mexican government. One of their main demands is for autonomy, because Mexico is not as, uniform as the U.S. in any region. Every state has pretty much developed on its own, and so the group really wants Chiapas to be able to be autonomous and figure out what it needs for itself, and just general elections for their state. Development. So, because it's a rural state of indigenous people, there has basically been no infrastructure put in, and no investment in the people or in any sort of things to make their lives better. There are a lot of places that don't even have electricity, so that was one huge demand that they have, especially because petroleum is in Chiapas and is extracted, and then the people of Chiapas don't see any of that money. And so they were called for a specific tax on that petroleum that would fund the electricity. They are extremely anti-NAFTA, especially because of the lack of labor qualifications, and talk out against that. The Article 27 of the Constitution is the one for having communal lands, and that everybody should have access to land in which they can work and are not that's not owned by other people. They have very few hospitals or health clinics throughout the entire state, and so that was a huge one. Radio that is run by the indigenous people to get information, because there's just a lack of information able to be distributed there. And then housing and schools, so that then people can not be illiterate and can improve their lives. And then these were specific demands that the women of the Zapatistas put forth, like childbirth clinics, child care, sufficient food, popular kitchens, communal grinding mills and tortilla presses, because they still have a very traditional diet, mostly of like tortillas and beans, tomatoes, squash. They demanded also to have the infrastructure to be able to start up different animal farms, baking projects, and workshops, to be able to make goods, to be able to sell, training schools, preschools, and then adequate means of transportation. Being in a rural area, it's really difficult for women to be able to get around. They often don't have that privilege. So, discrimination and repression. Being indigenous in Mexico has not been awesome because of a lot of discrimination and complete just marginalization of all of their issues, and then repression of any sort of political movements that have tried to be started, even peaceful ones. So they demand the end to discrimination, and the end to these schools that would come in and only speak Spanish. They demanded to have bilingual schools that would respect the culture and language of these indigenous communities, because though they do want to be part of the larger state of Mexico, they also want to be honest to their roots and to not have their culture destroyed by the state. At this point, when they were, this is from the 1994 declaration, and it was illegal to have any sort of political expression that did not go with the state, and so they wanted a reformation of that. And then also to get any sort of federal security forces out of their communities, because they were mostly basically just bullying the people all the time. And because of all of the federal security forces that were there, any sort of political uprisings or things like that would get kind of reprimanded, and people would be put in prison. So they wanted all of those people to be released, and then to bring a lot of the abusive politicians to trial because they had not had any sort of consequences. Feminism! Woohoo! Basically, the best part of Zapatistas.
That's a fantastic.
I know. Yes. So feminism within the Zapatistas is huge. So machismo is like really toxic and is all over Latin American culture, basically saying that like men have to be super manly and that women have to be like completely virginal and like so holy and aren't allowed to express themselves and like have to be mothers and very quiet wives and aren't allowed to be anything else. So they're strictly against that. They challenge gender roles and say that women are allowed to be in any sort of role and work that they want to be, that they are also, though, respectful of feminine work and not saying that child rearing and caring for little babes is not a valid work. So, like, while also allowing women to express themselves in the public sphere, there's still, like, this raising up of the private sphere, which is really important. They have an acceptance of self-determination, really big on women leadership, and they've also made sure that all of the women's demands, whether they're, like, in the community or in the capital, that, like, women are the ones who are going forth and are talking about these, which is huge. So you'll have, like, these groups of indigenous women going to Mexico City and, like, talking to these group full of, like, you know, staunch politician men, and they're just, like, so cool. And so they've also tried to have more national spaces of organization and reflection for women, because there's just been a lot of marginalization and a lot of abuse for a long time, and so to have spaces where women can come together and try and kind of improve their communities the way that they think they should be improved is super cool. Leadership, yeah. Okay, so they don't have a ton of leadership. This is Sucamentate Marcos, who's like one of the only people who has been a leader throughout the like 20 plus years. He actually just stepped down though, so they don't really have a big spokesperson. He wasn't like leader as in charge of things. He just spoke to the rest of the country about what the Zapatistas were doing. So they had a bunch of different like principles of how to do leadership and how to run their communities. One of them being construct, don't destroy. So when they're going into a new place, instead of just setting up the way that they want to do it and like pushing down everything else, they would like propose a way to do things and then have an open discussion of like, is that what we want to actually do? Is that going to work for us? Like, how do people who are actually going to be affected by these policies, like what do they want and how do they feel about it? There's a lot of accountability because these communities are so small, and they do consensus decision making whenever possible, but for the larger issues, the councils of good government will meet and discuss the things and decide. But like I said, they only are the same group of people for 2 weeks, so that people don't get power crazy. So one cool thing that I found out was that there's a, so like the Kurdish liberation movement has a lot in common with the Zapatistas in ways that are really awesome and revolutionary. One being their sort of democracy that is inclusive of all different social classes and ethnic groups in the areas that they're occupying, and horizontal instead of vertical leadership, kind of inviting people in whenever possible to make decisions. Safety for civilians in the face of a lot of violence coming from the state and the military. The Kurds who are in like Syria and Turkey and Iraq are obviously in a really violent place in the world, and southern Mexico is also pretty violent, and so having this group that is willing to go up in arms when necessary, but only against people who are like directly against them and are very anti hurting of any civilians is really important. Obviously the resistance of capitalism, the liberation of women, and the inclusion of women in their forces. Both groups are really big on autonomy and just being able to like run their own things the way that they think that they should be run instead of being told to do. Because both of them are mostly rural, environmental sustainability is huge, and so they've done some work like anti-GMO and anti-bioengineering work to try and maintain the sorts of crops that they have always raised. And then also the rejection of the vanguard, which was super cool because I just learned about this. And basically they were like, instead of the model where like a small group of people does a lot of the like revolution stuff and then other people are invited in, they want to destroy that model and have like every step that is possible include everybody who is interested in being a part of that and open it up to the community like all the time. So it's been like 22 years since the Zapatistas did the first uprising. So what happened? One huge thing is just that more people are talking about Indigenous issues, and they've put these Indigenous issues on the forefront of both like international things, but also within their own government. They've gotten to do more politically with going and speaking their issues to the national government and getting things done like that. In the different Zapatista communities, they have health and education infrastructure that they've erected. They haven't really gotten very much from the state. They've done a couple of different peace talks to try and de-escalate when things have gotten, well, the first 12 days were very violent, and then after that, the last 21 plus years, 22 plus years, have been pretty peaceful, but the state has tried to quiet them down by giving them small bits of money and infrastructure, but not nearly enough. So the Zapatistas have worked really hard to kind of empower the people to have their own health and education infrastructures. They have certain places in Chiapas which are self-governed, in which the Mexican state doesn't intervene. Obviously, rights for women are huge in all of those places. There's a lot more self-determination, a lot less child marriage, a lot less abuse and rape of women in those areas. And they're continuing all the time to challenge the way things are and to expand the area in which they are inviting people to rule themselves in this sort of way. Cool stuff. So this is the school for Chiapas, or I guess one of them. They have a program, the schools, which have like environmental or agricultural sustainability. They have women's schools. They have technical schools and like Maya Zapotec language schools all throughout Chiapas, which are really important. They launched the other campaign, basically where they would go around, a group of Zapatistas went around the entire country and then to other countries to try and talk with as many marginalized groups as possible and get as much input as possible for like how people would like to be able to like rule themselves, and how the best form of like development would be including all of the people who are usually ignored. And they had an intercontinental indigenous encounter a couple of years ago where they invited like all different indigenous groups to come to Chiapas and talk about indigenous issues and get them brought up in kind of a world stage, and to get more attention given to the indigenous issues that we're facing, specific groups, but also indigenous people as a whole. Okay, any questions?
So do they have like a Facebook page and stuff like that, or since they do like
School for Chiapas has a website, which is where I got this picture, which is cool. I assume they have a Facebook page. I haven't actually looked at it.
I don't know. I was just wondering how to see like stay updated on what they're doing.
Oh, they're doing a lot of cool stuff. Yeah, they have a lot of stuff on the internet that you can find pretty easily.
Presumably, if the Mexican state has been forced to give them some autonomy and some money, then the organizations of the Mexican state which have been handed over are available in Spanish to research what they're doing and where they have control.
Yeah.
Okay.
What are their economic policies, or do they have like economic autonomy within their communities, or how does that work?
I know that they do a lot to like have any sort of economic development like equally shared by everyone, and like have it always reinvested in the community, but I don't know specifically like how they set up markets or anything like that.
I wonder if it'd be like a specifically Marxist approach, or like have anything to do with like direct democracy.
Probably. I think that they would probably go with a mix of like whatever Marxist approach, but also probably whatever sort of economic model was going on before the Mexican state introduced capitalism to the area, because a lot of these places were still like really remote and didn't have that much interference from
What about the political parties? I know in their own areas they don't need the political parties, but perhaps because I've had some contact with what's left of the left wing of PRI, the Party of Institutional Revolution, which corruptly ruled as a dictatorship with American, as you know, Emily, condom, winking of the eye, Mexico for so long, but has now become an interesting mixture of both reform left-wingers, that's the president of the assembly I met back in Canada 10 years ago, and also the left-wing party, the Union of Democracy, which is a socialist party and has third representation in the thing. Have these left-wing parties coalesced at all with the Zapatistas, or is it still too dangerous for the left-wing of these highly represented parties in Mexico City and these parties which control some of the other states? Is it still too dangerous for them or to associate with the Zapatistas, or is indeed it too unrevolutionary still for the Zapatistas to cooperate with other reformers in Mexico?
Yeah, they definitely do political work and like talking to people in different parties, because they've been around for so long and have basically proved that they're just going to keep organizing, and they're not going to be violent. People will come and talk with them, but they have very high demands and are not going to stop.
The reason why I asked is one of your points was, I forget the article which said that the land should be given to the people.
Yeah.
You see, that was an early pre-demand, which, as you know, Party of Institutional Revolution, which pre-sold out, but still in the Constitution, and with the help of the gringos, the American imperialists, been defunded. And it's still the Obama administration, just as much as any Republican administration, which is determined not that Constitution in its left wing be funded or supported in any socialistic redistributive way. So some of the demands of the political parties of the left, when they were parties of the left, can still be used. Obviously, the Zapatistas feel it too.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a lot of different movements since. So, like, after the 1920 revolution in Mexico, everybody had the right to land redistribution, and all of it was like done, but it wasn't like actually done, just because there was so much corruption and like a lot of landowners who were really violent about keeping their stolen lands. And so, yeah, there's like definitely have been like politicians who have worked for that and who have said that that would happen. But I mean, it's just so entrenched in like the economic system as well.
Do we see, like you mentioned, how like rates of crime are generally much lower in Zapatista areas and whatever? What is the I imagine is the drug situation, like trafficking and narco-politics there much lower as well?
I didn't really see much about narco issues there, so I would say probably the issue is less prevalent. Yeah, most of the like drug area is in the highlands, and this is in the jungle, so it's I guess geographically hasn't been historically involved in that.